Well, let's dig into what is facing Rupert Murdoch. I mean, there was apparently new testimony, or I should say, a public testimony by the lead prosecutor, or I should say, investigator, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Sue Akers, who is leading the investigation known as I think it's the Levinson investigation in Britain. And these allegations are that the Sun, the Daily Sun, owned by Rupert Murdoch and News Corp, systematically paid bribes to, quote, a network of corrupted officials in the British police, in the British military, and in government agencies. Akers said that Murdoch had illegally paid unidentified officials hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for news tips, or I should say the Sun, paid hundreds of thousands of dollars in exchange for news tips and, quote, a salacious gossip. Said the payments had been authorized, and this is what is problematic for News Corp, at a very senior level within the newspaper. Now, this is the second newspaper now that has faced these allegations. And she said, Akers speaking, there appears to have been a culture at the Sun of illegal payments, and systems have been created to facilitate such payments whilst hiding the identity of the officials receiving money. This is very important because if there's a cover-up, there's an indication that people were aware that it was going on. This is the Levinson inquiry. Simultaneously, a lawyer for the Levinson inquiry said that Rebecca Brooks, who was the former Murdoch executive in charge of overseeing the news of the world, was apparently informed by police in 2006 that detectives had evidence of the voicemail hacking. This is also contrary to what she has testified as late as 2010. So you now have two newspapers implicated. You have a across-the-board evidence of cover-ups, that it was not rogue employees that were doing this. When you're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments, this doesn't just happen because one reporter's just like, oh, I must have had too much lunch that day. They don't just come back and use bad British accents to claim that they've overset. In fact, Akers said, the cases we are investigating are not ones involving the odd drink or meal to police officers or other public officials. Instead, these are cases in which arrests have been made involving the delivery of regular, frequent, and sometimes significant sums of money to small numbers of public officials by journalists. Emails show that one Sun journalist received more than $235,000 in cash over several years to pay his sources, a number of whom were public officials. She also said that there were emails showing that reporters and officials at the newspaper were afraid of losing their job or getting in trouble with the law because of this stuff. And then on Monday, apparently there were other testimony in which a former high-ranking police officer said that News International, this is the owners of News of the World, owned a subsidiary of News Corp, had deliberately obstructed police investigations into the phone hacking. And today, there is the latest revelation from the Levinson inquiry that one of their conduits for information, this is one of the news world's main sources, and you can say source or you can say conduits or sources conduits for information from serving police officers, potentially in return for legal cash payments. In other words, people that they've been basically bribing for information, was a private investigator named Jonathan Rees. This was a guy who was investigated and tried for the murder of his business partner. This trial apparently collapsed and fell apart because of the Metropolitan Police Department's poor handling of evidence. And this evidence dealt with the revelation of these corrupted police officers. And during this investigation into this murder, News of the World apparently provided surveillance resources to the private investigator and harassed detectives on the case who were chasing after this private investigator. So now what you have is they're not only protecting the guy who was paying off the cops, they're protecting him from a separate murder investigation that he was involved with. So I can understand why Rupert is floating the idea that maybe James should go to prison, at least on this program. Rupert Murdoch is floating this stuff because they're in big trouble, and this is not going to end in Britain. Because this was a culture of corruption, if they are found to be paying off public officials, not just from one entity in an isolated instance, but from two separate entities owned by the company, it is very likely that News Corp is going to be subject to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Guardian UK quotes Mark McDougall, partner from a Washington office of the law firm Aiken Gump, Strauss, Hauer, and Feld, and a former federal prosecutor. This is obviously a very significant development with regards to the likelihood of a U.S. prosecution. If the British authorities are articulating a pattern, a defined scheme to bribe officials, that's a very big deal. Mike Kohler, professor of business law at Butler University. Last July, when we first started talking about this, there was one newspaper, the News of the World, in one category of foreign official, the police. Now we have another newspaper in a much broader category of foreign officials. The evidence seems to suggest there was a recognition that these payments may have been illegal. This is in reference to the emails that the investigator Akers was talking about. And the notion that there were attempts to disguise the nature of these payments. These elements would fall under the jurisdiction of the Foreign Corruption Practices Act. Tom Fox, a Houston-based lawyer who specializes in these cases. Speaking of a culture of corruption is really bad, said Fox. No pun intended. There are two main types of SCPA case. In the first, a company has policies in place but fails to detect corruption. The second is far worse, and that's when there is a program in place and you ignore it. So, if I was at Fox and Friends right now, I'd be wondering who my new boss is going to be.